Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Dr. Samuel M. Jordan Center for Persian Studies at UC Irvine. It is a pleasure to have today with us Professor Mateo Farzaneh and Professor Ali Akbar Mahdi, who are going to be engaging in a discussion on Dr. Farzaneh's latest book, Iranian Women and Gender in the Iran-Iraq War. Dr. Arya Morknat, who is our philosopher in resident at the center, will give the proper introduction to both of our scholars here, one in Chicago and one in California. Again, it's a great honor to have both of you here. And without further ado, I'm going to have Dr. Morknat take the Zoom.
Thank you very much, Professor Daryei, and welcome back everyone to our another virtual event at UCI Jordan Center for Persian Studies. It's my pleasure today to introduce our guests. The author of the book, Iranian Women and Gender in the Iran-Iraq War, Mateo Mohammad Farzaneh, is an associate professor of history and the principal of the Mossadegh Initiative at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago. He's also the author of the Iranian Constitutional Revolution and the Clerical Leadership of Khorasani. And the book in case is this one that I have. I believe that there will be a link in our chat box for those who are interested in purchasing one. Ali Akbar Mahdi is a lecturer in sociology at California State University, Northridge, and a professor emeritus from Ohio Wesleyan University. He's the author of Sociology of the Iranian Family, Teen Life in the Middle East, Culture and Customs of Iran, which is co-authored with Elton Daniel. Sociology in Iran, again co-authored with Abdul Ali Lahsaizadeh. Resources for teaching sociology of development and women in development and Iranian culture, civil society, and concern for democracy. So in a few seconds, I will turn myself off and then leave the floor to Dr. Mahdi and Farzaneh for a very interesting conversation about this book. And then we'll come back and open the floor for you guys to answer your questions and comments. Thank you. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess I'll start. Before we start, I'd like to thank Dr. Daryei and the Jordan Center for the kind invitation, and Saeed Jalalipour for organizing as always. Thank you, Saeed. And of course, Dr. Morknat, whom we have the honor of having to sort of moderate as we go on. And of course, Dr. Mahdi for actually reading the book. And he just showed me he has about 120 questions, but I don't think we're going to go through all of them. But thank you so much for accepting to do this, Dr. Mahdi. I know how busy you are. So let me share my slideshow so we can get some visuals going here. Can everybody see the slideshow?
Yes.
Yes. So one of the things that people in war studies and conflict studies, and it doesn't matter which field we're talking about, mostly in the Middle East or in Iranian studies, as this is more pertinent, people think that wars are only fought by men. And usually men get all the nice accolades of bravery, chivalry, sacrifice. And the case of the Iran-Iraq war was not any different. But the truth of the matter is that for every male who fights in a war, including the Iran-Iraq war, at least one, and more likely 2, 3, 4, or 5 females or women actually help him fight it. And as I said, this is true of all nations in all regions. This is true of all fields of studies. And women and gender studies in particular pays less attention to this fact. And perhaps one of the more pressing reasons why I wanted to do this, because we hear so much about the sacrifices of men. We don't hear about the sacrifices that women make in conflicts such as this. Um, People ask as to why I wrote this book, or I started to research this book. It's very simple. The Iran-Iraq War, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, was the longest war of the 20th century. It effectively solidified the newly established Islamic Republic, and the main consequences of the war is the status quo that you have in Iran right now, with the overwhelming power that the Revolutionary Guards and all the other revolutionary organizations and the militia has in Iran. Simply with the war, when it started, all of these organizations started to grow within the war. And in the current political climate, especially with the presidential elections, within a couple of weeks, you have 3 or 4 veterans of the war that are actually candidates for presidency. So the effect of the war goes beyond the time that it was fought, and we are experiencing the consequences of that now, and we will for the remaining future, I would say, for the next 50 to 100 years, because wars have a long sort of shelf life when it comes to its consequences. And you see, as you see in other places, we're still talking about World War II and World War I, of course, in a different context. I calculated the number of men that actually died in the war, 208,000, close to 209,000. The number of men that were injured, about 575,000. The number of men that served time as POWs, prisoners of war in Iraq, for any variation of time, over 43,000, and we have close to 12,000 souls that are still missing, or MIAs, missing in action. So the average of the calculation or the tabulation of all these groups rounds up to over 837,000. And we can, by the argument that I provided at the beginning, that no war can be fought without participation of women, at least 837,918 women actually fought in the war in a different context. And as you can see on the data, less than 7,000 died in the war. About 6,000 were injured in the war, some severely injured in the battlefield and beyond. The Islamic Republic currently holds the number of official women POWs at 41, but some other sources mention 171. And of course, we don't know the number of women that are MIAs. And among the MIA women are those that were actually murdered by Iranian families themselves, simply because they were subject to sexual assault in the first few months of the war. And those numbers are unknown. So as I said, the official war narrative in Iran portrays it as a all-male endeavor. Men made all the sacrifices. It indicates that only men protected the realm or the nation. Claims that women's role was only to reproduce and raise brave sons to dedicate to the war, which is the official line of the state. And it says that women took care of the family while men fought, which is to a certain extent true, but not entirely. You see how the state, at the time that the war was raging, from 1980 to 1988, the state media, print media, published over 20,000 articles pertaining to the war, and only 93 articles mention anything about women. And out of those 93 articles that mention women, almost, I would say 95% to 96% of them, a huge number of them, only mention women in the context of their responsibility as people that would volunteer their men to war. So they make heroes out of women because of their sort of role in reproduction and in suggestion for men to go to war, which effectively says a lot about how we think of women in war in general, specifically in the Iran-Iraq war. The photo that you see on the right, I took this photo in 2009 when I visited Khorramshahr, which is in the southwest. This city was occupied, and it fell after 34 days of resistance and protection and defense by men and women of the city and the surrounding areas. And this photo was taken in the Jame Mosque, which is the epitome of the sacred defense of the Iran-Iraq war, because it served as a major hub for everything that was going on in those 34 days. And not a single photo on this wall is actually of women. And I knew very well that there were a great deal of women who died in the city while they were fighting as combatants, as first responders, as cooks, as ambulance drivers, and what have you. And I discuss all of this in the book. And it was then that I actually thought it would be a grave academic injustice, if not unfair to women not to talk about them and their participation in the war. So you could say that the Jame Mosque in summer of 2009 is perhaps the trigger point that I started to think about writing something about women. And I never thought it's going to turn into a book. First, I thought that it's going to be an article of some sort, but the abundance of evidence that I had to, that I didn't know exists, once I started to dig in to various sources, I realized their role was a lot greater than we give them credit for. One of the most difficult things about writing about war is to find sources, especially in Iran. In general, I mentioned in the book, doing research in Iran is like playing Russian roulette. You don't know the consequences of who's watching and what they're thinking while you're doing your research. So I actually started looking at the sources of the state and sources that women had produced. And this is just a sample, small sample of the books by various organizations that are connected to the Islamic Republic. So I looked at memoirs that women actually wrote themselves. I looked at private collections of photos that women had either taken or men had taken about women, but they were not publicized too much. Looked at some documents that were collecting dust, and they deemed them as insignificant because they were discussing women in general. Identification cards, of course, by Revolutionary Guards, by Basij, the mobilization force, by the Red Crescent. Audio video recordings of women or men that mention women in some aspect. And of course, Red Cross records and the Red Crescent records in Iran that overwhelmingly had a volunteer force that were all women. For example, there was the Qatar Ahmar, which is short for the train for the Red Crescent, which ran from Tehran to all the way to Bushehr during the time of the war, on and off. And this was a train, it was a fully loaded hospital, fully functioning hospital that would carry the injured. And the train almost entirely was run by women, except for a few men that were the conductors and were runners, and some Revolutionary Guards people that were actually protecting it, going through. And this would go to Ahvaz and to Bushehr, and they would bring the less injured people that could take time, 24 hours or so before they get to Tehran. So all of these records were basically untouched. So what I realized is that nobody had looked at these records to look at them from a historical perspective as to how women actually participated in the war. And that became really, really a big help. In the book, I talk about several contexts that I discuss about women. Of course, I do talk about the Iranian women in general from 1925 to 1980 to the beginning of the war, and doing research on women and gender in Iran during the Pahlavi dynasty, the Pahlavi the first and the second monarch, and then during the 18-19 months that it took for the Islamic Republic to write the constitution, to establish the parliament and to establish the judicial laws and the family courts and all that. And out of that came another project that I'm working on, which I'm basically looking at the kind of women that Women in Gender Studies has not entirely focused on, people that are from the margins, from the periphery of the Iranian women's population. So chapter 2 kind of serves as a sort of a hint as to what I'll be doing for my next big project, which it will take a few years perhaps to complete. Then I divide up women between the women that were actually at the front lines of Khorramshahr Abadan, and that became the longest chapter simply because of the massive amount of sources that were available and the analysis that I needed to do to understand the participation of these women. In this chapter, pretty much all the roles, all the 18 roles, I think, or 17 roles that I discussed that women actually participate are mentioned in this chapter. That's why it's a longer one. Then I talk about women that are actually getting paid during the war, that got paid for their participation, for helping with the war efforts. And these include not only employees of the state, but people that were working for the IRIB, for the broadcast system in Iran, official photographers, commanders of the Revolutionary Guards, a couple of them. I talk about, we had one woman pilot who was hired to run or fly reconnaissance missions for the war machine. And then in the following chapter, I talk about the home sacrifices, the home front sacrifices, where you see a mixture of women's involvement in a variety of roles that, although I knew about this firsthand since I had participated in the war myself, to a certain degree, I didn't know the extent of it. And that to me was quite an eye-opener. Participation in unlikely places, like in the train, that I don't think anybody had talked about women working actually in the train and in other places, in field hospitals that were quite dangerous places. These are right at the front lines, within stone's throw away from the Iraqi army, especially in Dasht Azadagan, which is outside of Shush Danial and Dimeshq in the southwest and in other places. The female prisoners of war, again, in Iran, this gets very little coverage, with the exception of a couple of books that had come out by people that had served time first in secret prisons in Iraq. I thought that was quite fascinating to share, and I wanted to share their stories. And what I've done in the book, mostly it's got a lot of stories, and I'm sure Dr. Mahdi is going to talk about those. I wanted to put a human name and a human face to these stories, and don't just say that women participated in the war. I wanted to show that these are actual people with lives, with families, with children, or they're very, very young. They hadn't even married then. They were either, they would fall in love with people that they were serving with. So there's a lot of romance, and there's a lot of taboo stories that one might think the Islamic Republic doesn't want to talk about, but these women do talk about them in their books or in their interviews that I've listened to, and I reflect that also in the book. Chapters 8, 9, and 10 pretty much talk about the effects of the war after the last bullet is fired or the last bomb is dropped. The war officially ends with a ceasefire. Technically, we're still in a war with Iraq. Iran's still in a war with Iraq since there's a ceasefire, and that still continues because of the resolution that was passed by the UN Security Council and the UN then. So from the time that the ceasefire is announced and accepted by Ayatollah Khomeini, essentially the state, these women continue to fight in a different mode, if you will. And I wanted to cover that as well. And that continues with women that are still taking care of either themselves because they were chemically wounded or they were disabled in the war with the challenges that they had. And the state, people might be surprised, the state, despite what we hear in the official media, the state does very little to alleviate the hardship and the pain that these people are going through, and women are no exception. So in that regard, they are treating women equally as to men. They're just basically ignoring them in that regard. And then the challenges that still exist in, the idea of women and gender in Iran. I talk about that in the last chapter. Without getting too political, I do talk about the challenges that remain and perhaps not offering much of solutions because that wasn't my purpose of writing the book, but kind of hinting to the idea that although women participated in something as grave as a war and they sacrificed beyond anybody's imagination, they did not get what they had fought for. And one thing before we enter into a discussion mode with Dr. Mahdi is to say that my conclusion was that the Iranian women that participated proved to be the most patriotic out of women that existed in Iran at the time. And I'm not suggesting that people that didn't participate are not patriotic. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that their participation basically put them in a different level in exhibiting, demonstrating their patriotism, which to me was very, very interesting. And also the fact that the majority of the women that actually participated did not come from an upper echelon of the society. As anybody who is familiar with conflict studies knows that usually the sense of patriotism and participation in wars is basically shared with people that are from the undereducated, perhaps, or non-educated in the case of some of the women that I discuss here, and from the lower socioeconomic factors. And that to me also was an eye-opening experience as well. So I think I'll just stop there, and I'm going to stop the slideshow, and I hope that was enough as a way of a segue to enter our second part of the discussion today. Thank you. We can't hear you, Dr. Matthew.
I would like first to congratulate you in a wonderful book, and thank you for the such a huge contribution to an area which we don't know much about, because first of all, most of us, at least people who are outside of the country, we're not there, we did not participate in war, and you did. And not only that, but you also are bringing, shedding light on something that, as you mentioned yourself, mentioned today, and you mentioned it in the book. In women's study, there's not much attention have been paid to this segment of the population and their effort, particularly Iranian women, in the war. And beyond that, I think one more thing is that overwhelmingly is clear when you read your book is a contribution in area of religious women, an area again which does not get enough attention. I do not go that far to say that the secular women's studies does not pay attention, but they do approach it in a more categorical form, so as workers and as a peasants family and this and that. But the way in which you have approached these people, in particular, going after names, and this is one of the That's what makes your book so huge and a lot of work, because literally in every chapter, I have a hard time even to remember any names, because by the end of the, there's somewhere I get a sense of over 200
Right.
specific,
220, right. Right.
under 25 or 22. That's a lot of name. And you go through their personal lives. You just really pay attention to who they were, where they came from, and what they were up to in the war, and the pain and agony. I do have to say that I read chapter 3 with tears in my eyes. And it's just, it's a lot of name, a lot of work, a lot of stories, that unimaginable situation. The mother or finding the pieces of her own son in the body, or pieces, or in the out of unexpectedly, and so on, and yet being devoted to the work and continue to do those things. So I do want to say that this is a great contribution, not only to women study, it is also to studies of religious devotion among women, and also women of the working class and rural areas and small towns or rural towns of the country. But picking up on your last issue, I mean, I will ask a couple of informational questions, and then we can raise a couple of other issues. The last point, actually, you mentioned on the case of the women, and mostly the war being fought, but by women of the less socioeconomic status, and mostly people from rural area and small towns and so on, not major cities. Have you run into any kind of literature that the secular women had done on the women in war at all? That's one. But pursuing that, you had mentioned that actually these women are mostly people from coming those areas. Would it be more available to the secular women? We do have some literature of Iranian opposition groups who at the beginning of the particularly leftist women, because we know that women prior to revolution, the only groups of women who were involved in at least some kind of a fighting, of course, it was a guerrilla war and it wasn't really typical. Later, of course, they got involved in Kurdistan and some of the things that ethnic clashes that took place at the beginning of the revolution. But I had read some of these accounts that they indicated that they were not allowed to the front of the war. In other words, if the secular women have you run into the literature on that, and indicating that also that they were barred from entering to the war?
Mm-hmm. Let me ask the second question first, because I tend to forget things. I haven't seen any book that is written with the idea of secularity of one's beliefs or identity that discusses war. The interesting thing about all these books that these women have written is that, for example, Shahla de Bozorgi, who was the pilot from Shiraz, who participated in the war, she doesn't write her book, which I forget the name, it's in the bibliography. She doesn't write it from the perspective of being a religious person. So she writes it from a secular, background. But the interesting thing about her is that you kind of have to dig through, and that's what historians do, right? We kind of turn things upside down a little bit. Everybody goes for the obvious, and I didn't go for the obvious. I wanted to see who is actually participating, what are the reasons. That's why I classify them as religious or devout. I don't know if that makes any sense. So no, I haven't seen anything. The leftist woman that you're talking about, because I did the majority of my research in Iran, obviously that wouldn't be available. The leftist woman that we call leftists here in the state publication world in Iran, they're mentioned as the people, as munafiqeen, right, as a mujahideen women. And I think I discuss in several chapters how these women classify the leftist women, if you want to call them that, they classify them as the fifth element or the fifth column in the war. So from that aspect, no, I haven't seen anything that I could say, you could say these are religious women writing about their experience, and these are the non-religious, or if you want to say secular women. I don't know if that answers your question, but go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, finish.
But the first question, if you could repeat the first question, I would appreciate it. I know I forget the question.
My concern is that, my question is really, I get an unspoken assumption in your book, after you reading the book, that somehow the war is fought by women who are religious.
Yes,
and the secular women have no place in it. And then let me say that it's interesting you brought up another question that later I had, and about the Meek women, Mujahideen women.
Right.
Wherever you have this fifth column, women or people who are involved in the war or in the community, and they are spying to pass the information to the Iraqis and so on, you often equate the two, Meek and fifth column. It might very well be that was the language that the Sepah or the men in the army, the people in charge, they were identifying them. But were they all the same, really, or not? I mean, that's...
The only group of women, the only group of the leftists, as far as I know, maybe somebody else knows this better than I do, that actually helped the Iraqi army were the women that were connected with the Mujahideen.
Yeah.
So that assumption is not that far out, actually. Okay. Were the secular women allowed to participate? Any woman was allowed to participate. The thing about the war was that, first of all, I think I discussed several things, and I borrowed this from Butler, I think, that women that actually fight in national crises or get involved in national crises usually are ethnic, they might speak a different language, and they're from the periphery. So people of the Paytaht or the capital, I do talk about Tahmine Ardakani, who comes from Qaytariye, which is a nice part of the northern part of Tehran, and she gets involved, and her brothers get involved in the war. But she does not present herself, and the sources don't present themselves putting this in a context of secularity. See what I'm saying? Yes, remember, the war narrative still owned by the state, right? The state owns this narrative, and all these publications that do come out. It's interesting to mention, without forgetting your question, it's interesting to mention that private publishers that do publish about women, they do not touch this subject whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason for that, I think. And the reason for that is that there is this notion within the Iranian society that if you participated in the war, that if you had a son or a husband who died as a martyr, you must be an arm of the Islamic Republic even today. So there is that equation, and you talk to children of the martyrs, they all say the same thing. You talk to the wives of the martyrs, they all say the same thing. And they could actually be, so somebody has to have a friend in London whose father was actually working for the army, was an army colonel who died. And although she comes from a very secular family, she gets painted as the martyr's child, and that's why she got to go to the university, and she got the treatment that the state gives to these people. So it cannot be that clear cut. The secularity part, nobody talks about it from that perspective and writes a book or writes an article or writes a blog saying, look, we were secular, but we loved Iran and that's why we participated. Nobody has come across and said, you know, I wanted to participate, but nobody let me. Soila Farjanfar, who is a nurse that I talk about, she's from Abadan, and she serves at the Wahdati Air Base in this school for the duration of the war for at least a couple of years, having small children, leaving them behind. And in her book, there is not a single mention of her religiosity, right? But you read between the lines that there is this engine of religion. There is this engine of belief that puts their fear in sort of in check. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
the interesting thing is that most of your description is really focused on when it describes these women, and I mean, you regard two major variables as a source of cause of these people for motivation for them to be in the war.
Right.
One is their love of the country and fighting for their country, nation, and then the other one being for religion, or
Islam.
in a variety of ways. Islam, yeah, whether it's the religion, they want to protect their religion, whether the religion tells them to fight. But anyway, they come out as all of them being devoted to this religion, and that a little bit leaves me that, are they all really like that? Let me just go a step further, actually. When you get to the later chapter, when you talk about women of the state, and then the women who came later out after the war, one of the things is that it becomes clear that some of these people, after all, they are going to get a job. They are going to have a salary. So there are some material foundation. It's not just religion and also the romance of nation, fighting for nation. So nationalism alone and religion alone is not, but also there is a motivation for some of these, particularly those who make it. Of course, it was a big risk. Anybody who goes to war may not come back, as many did not. But those who came back, we see them actually having to argue, and the men who actually are organizing or organize the war, and then later are leaving them out, actually. So they have to struggle for getting disability and all challenges that you actually mentioned very well.
Well, I have one example in the book. I think Iran Torabi, the woman who comes from Tuiserkan or outside of Tuiserkan, like a village outside of a village of a village. So from a very isolated area, from a very conservative background, and she becomes a anesthesiology technician. In her book, she mentions something to the effect that, if you serve in Desful or in Shush, at the field hospital, I forget the name, right outside of Shush, she mentions that we get paid 3 times as much as if we were serving in Tehran. So you're absolutely right. There is a monetary compensation, right? But that's only for the women of the state. Even the women of the state, I do talk about how we're kind of torn. What you're saying exactly, I think I discussed that. We're kind of torn to realize, are they really religious people or is this their job? What about the woman surgeon who works at Saripol Zahab, at the field hospital there? What about the women that actually work in Kermanshah or in Elam? They're all surgeons, they're doctors, they come from, and if you remember, you weren't there, but those people who were actually in Iran at the time, if you were in medical school and you were doing residency, you could not get your degree actually till you actually served some time in the war front, either in the back line or the front line in some field hospital. So it was required of them. They could totally disagree with the Islamic Republic or Ayatollah Khomeini's ideas about how the society should be run, but they were actually, I don't want to say forced, but they had to participate because there was no other option, right? But the overwhelming majority of women that actually do this, those are the ones that have written something that I could go to and look at it as a source. And these women are by majority religious.
Yes.
So I'll just stop there. I don't know if that
where you mentioned Islam, and I rather looking at that as ideology, but the ideology is not just in terms of the motivation of these women and the nationalism and ideology or Islam, but ideology also frames the behavior of these people. It shapes the behavior in the context of war. These women, regardless of who they are, they have to appear the way, at least it's defined in the war setting, protect themselves. Or I noticed some of the pictures you have of the car, they're called brothers or sisters and so on, even in formal language and so on. So the men who were writing the framework of the war and the conduct of the war to a large extent, they were also shaping the lives and behavior and contribution of these women.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and see, people think about that and they think, yes, I do mention in the book, and I say the mismanagement or the management, I put mis in parentheses in all the places when I'm talking about management of the war, the mismanagement of the war causes women to suffer even more.
Mm-hmm.
Just like the mismanagement of the, because I think I have some stories about Zahra Hosseini where she actually goes into the war room and she objects to the way the war is being fought because she sees something that is completely different, and people tell her, you're a woman, get out of here. I mean, you don't even have a right to have your opinion. So by no means do I paint this glorious picture that these women did not experience misogyny at the time that their help was most needed. I mean, think about this. If even Ayatollah Khomeini, in all of his sermons, he points to the fact that if the women don't okay this, we're not going to win this war, or this cannot go on. Realizing that with all the hoopla that men have in the Middle East or in Islamic societies, women have a greater part of the decision-making process, but it's different. It comes from a different venue. And for these women, I think it's exactly the same thing.
I think two things that actually along that line, that its contribution of your work, and as I read it, as I understood, one is that actually indicates to me that how the state, Islamic Republic, a theocratic government, evolved, and how it actually adjusted itself to the changes and necessities of any situation. You discuss the fact that the wars, there all kinds of war, women have always been in all wars, contributing, some on the back or some of them in front and so on. And it varies by culture. For instance, even Algerian war, you mentioned, or Russian wars and so on. But they appear in the war according to the culture that they have. And here again, according to the dominant culture of the government, Islamic Republic, a neo-theocratic government, these women have to appear in that manner. But the interesting thing is that the state, the war pushed the state. This is what I get at from reading through the literature that you provide in terms of a war really pushed the state to confront reality of, or the contradiction of its own position toward women. And it has to, because it needed them, but then it had to redefine them.
Yeah, absolutely. I do mention the idea that nobody foresaw that there's going to come. I mean, they had just ratified the Constitution, and I do mention a couple of the articles that's related to women's rights in the judiciary, in the Constitution, constitutional laws pertaining to women and gender, which basically gives all the rights to Islamic jurists to decide what their rights are as opposed to not. Nobody thought that there's going to be a time. I think what they were thinking, the people that made the revolution Islamic or Republic for that matter, they didn't think that there's going to be a time that they're going to need these women, that they were going back on their words. Essentially, what Ayatollah Khomeini said in Paris about women and what he said when he was in Iran were two different things. Everybody knows that, right? I don't think he even imagined that there's going to be a time that the same woman that you're trying to make an interior being out of, they're going to make them andarunis, right? Once again, they're going to do that. He never thought that there's going to be a time that you're actually going to need these women if you're going to save your own ass. Sorry for being so blunt, because that's exactly what it's going to take. Without these women, they couldn't have all these, the medical staff, the nursing staff, all these women, the same women that he told them, you got to go back home, you got to go, your stove is your office, your kitchen is your office, you got to go back and, do your service over there. Once he gets a dispatch from the Friday prayer leader in Abadan, I mentioned that in the book, because he sees all these women and he knows without these women, they can't fight this war. So he's forced to contact the office of Ayatollah Khomeini saying, what do you say about this? Because there is this confusion in a national crisis, right? Which is the war. And Ayatollah Khomeini says, just be careful so you don't get captured and raped by Iraqis. That's it. That's his only concern. He doesn't talk about be careful they don't die. He doesn't say protect them, from all ills. He goes after something that is the stereotypical. Once we mentioned about keeping your honor, that's the only thing he's worried about. And most of the men that talk about the war in their own books, that's the only concern they have. They don't talk about the bravery of the woman. I mean, there's like thousands of books that actually men wrote about the war that they participated in as commanders and what have you, as the brains to manage or mismanage the war. Not a single one of them mentioned a woman.
It's interesting that, by the way, it should be said that you mentioned a lot, and you bring a lot of cases of where these women actually were mocked in the war, or the men did not want to give them, or didn't even think that they're capable of handling the situation and pushing them back. But what makes it, of course, we know that the war and the hostage crisis, those are two things that one of them, Ayatollah Khomeini, called it the second revolution, the hostage crisis, who really helped the Islamic Republic to consolidate its power and establish. But war helped them to actually adjust themselves to the reality of the gender. But then what is really interesting, the picture I get from your book, of course, you emphasize a lot about the Iranian women, their capability and courage and so on, is the fact that most of the classical war, in every war, women are needed on the back or in front or whatever, and they have called them in. But usually when the war was over, push them back.
Right.
In case of Iranian women, this is interesting. The state still had performed that way, but women did not go back. Right. Women are staying in the public, and they are demanding more and actually pushing the state.
And you know what the reason for that is, I think. Sorry to cut you off there.
No, that's fine.
The reason for that is, I think you and I had a discussion about this a while back. The class of women that the Islamic Republic allowed to shine because of their participation in the revolution, and I'm not going to get into the ideology, whether they were right or wrong. This is not the place to do it. Because they participated in the revolution in an Islamic conservative context, wearing their chador and their hijab, it's the first time in the history of those women that they're actually being told that we need you. Mm-hmm. Yes. You see what I'm saying? Yes. And I think this confidence that they get is what has allowed the Iranian women today to do things that are quite different from women of the region in general. Mm-hmm. So one example that I give is, it's fascinating to me to read about Masumeh Ramhormuzi or Khadijeh Mirshikar, these women that came from highly conservative backgrounds. One of them couldn't even have a television in their own house because their father said this is decadent stuff that the Pahlavi regime is putting out. She was denied a high school education because her father didn't want her to go a short distance to another town to attend a all-girls high school. The same father actually mandates the daughter, once the war starts, that you are responsible to protect your nation. And he is perfectly okay for that woman to participate in the war among a whole bunch of young men who are absolute strangers, and they would spend day in, day out, night after night in bunkers and in different bases, and the father would not even flinch or object to any of that. I find that actually fascinating as being part of the Iranian women, the kind of women that I say again, nobody wants to pay attention to simply for a variety of reasons. And I think that's something worth further examination, because I think there is a wealth of information out there about these women, because we don't have a complete picture of Iranian women if we don't take them into consideration.
Yeah. I think the fascinating aspects of your work is really, if I can summarize it in one word, is agency. The Iranian women show their own agency, that religious women are not, first of all, those passive women that, people have assumed, and they don't, yes, they do follow their religious orders or religious edicts, but yet they do have their own interpretation. And when this is the structural part of it, when the opportunity arises, when they are given a chance, they actually are capable of interpreting and taking it to the maximum of what their capabilities are and their desires are. And often those desires are not what traditionally the religious leaders wanted them, that to be just mother and wife alone. Right. And they prove themselves. And this is one of the fascinating things about the Iranian women in that regard. Let me ask, for the sake of time, we want to go to the question. I noticed that there are 5 or so questions out there. We want to hear the audience also. This question, you say that the women who went to war, they were modern. I was concerned about your notion of modernness. And so in what sense they're modern versus some?
They're modern in the sense that if we talk about French women participating in World War II, right? Yeah. We call them modern. And we have that description of modernness, which we confuse mostly with Westernization. And we can get into that discussion, I think, and that would be a few hours. But they're modern in the sense that they're not afraid of participating in something that the religious establishment has forbid them to do since they're very, very young. And that is to hang out with people that they don't know. So the modernist comes from their nature of being progressive and not being too scared to participate in something that somebody might say, that's not a very womanly thing to do, or not a Muslim woman would never do that. That's my description. I think Lara Deep discusses that also, and Saba Mahmoud talks about that, about the Egyptian woman. Yeah.
But the fact is that these women are participating in the war, and women have always participated in the war. And all the time, the question of how they participate, it's not defined by the weapon that they use necessarily. We say modern war versus classical war in terms of their weaponry, condition, and the manner in which it's conducted. And in this context, I see that women are, but the concept of modernity or being modern is more of in terms of the attitude, the behavior, the personality. Of course, they do have the ability to go on. And it seems to me that then we would have assumed the women who are not, the women who are, let's say, traditional and religious, we have a fixed notion of them. They don't. They do adjust themselves to the situation, but they opposed a lot of modernity. They opposed the Western types of behavior and culture and so on. So I had a little concern about that.
That's the problem that I have, Westernization and modernity, because modernity is not just Westernization. You could be a modern person, not be, not liking the social values or social mores of the West, right? And I think that's the problem with understanding modern women. If you say modern, everybody automatically thinks, oh, modern means you don't wear a hijab. Modern is you maybe smoke a cigarette in public. Modern is maybe, you hang out with men that you don't know. In our culture, I think when we're talking about modern, I mean, look at the stuff that appears in blogs and social media and in books. All the women that actually we celebrate are the women that come from the echelon, from the higher echelon of the society, right?
That's true.
And they call them modern. So I think there has to be a clarification made between modernization and Westernization. Westernizing, these women don't like. They don't appreciate that that sense of social decadence that I've interviewed these women, and they consider themselves modern in their own context. And that modernity comes from the fact that they're doing things that everybody says they're incapable of doing, but they're not doing it in the context of the West.
Then help me with your concept of the other woman, which you get it from,
The other women are the women that nobody discusses. The other women are the women that are undereducated or not educated, they're poor, but they have a great deal of influence within the society because they raise their children, because they participate in the home economy. They can even, they work, they are breadwinners, but because they come from a certain neighborhood, nobody wants to consider them as part of the greater picture of the Iranian woman. I think the women of Sistan are just as much should be included as the women of Tehran. And, I always make the example, north of Vanak is what everybody is concerned about. I mean, all the books that are coming out about Iran in anthropology, in sociology, everybody does their research with women that are in the arts. I mean, these people that are poor, they're not too concerned about the arts, right? Or they're not educated enough to know about literature or participation in the literary circles and what have you. You're not going to find them in the Shabhai Bukhara or the Nights of Bukhara that are held. Those women are not there. My concern is that we have a very favorable, good smelling kind of a part of the society that we're at ease with. So we want to discuss them. We are not comfortable with the ones with the facial hair, with the hijab, with the ones that might not even want to talk to us simply because we are men. I did encounter those women. I mean, one of the photos that I have in the book, I literally had to give an hour and a half lecture to this woman who had taken the photo because she thought the kind of use that I want to do with the photo, how it's going to portray women that actually participated in the war, right? So if from their perspective, they see it exactly like I'm telling you. They see it that we're not even considered women to these people. Everybody's concentrating on the ones that are film directors or actors, or they play a musical instrument, or maybe they've gone to overseas and they speak French or Italian or English or whatever. And that's not the full picture of the Iranian woman.
Well, thank you. I think time-wise, we are at 5 o'clock. And so we go ahead, Dr. Morknat, so you can help us.
Of course. Thanks to both of you for this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Dr. Farzaneh, for your research and contribution to this broad and multifaceted topic. I'm sure further researchers will be built on the ground that you have made in this book. So I'm just going to narrow down the questions based on the relevance to our conversation today, and then you can begin answering them. So if you're ready, I'm going to read the first one.
Please.
All right. So do you think there has been a recent movement in the past few years within Iran to better recognize the role of women in war? For example, comments by General Kargar or the recent attempt by Tahmina Milani to make a film about the role of women in the war.
Yes, I think there has been, truth be told. Nargis Abkari, I think she's worked on that. Tahmina Milani has worked on that. Yes, the thing about those films in particular, though, is I still sense a sort of wanting to be distant from the total ideology of the Iranian woman, and they sort of romanticize this idea of women's participation, where I think there is more to the story than just romanticization of their stories. How could I say this clearer, perhaps, is that nobody's made a movie about Fatemi Jushi, who was in the war for 6 years, and she actually participates in the revolution. And based on her own stories, she's done some stuff that she's not very proud of. So I want to see more work done on those kind of women that, again, we see them as very, very different. But I'm sure there are very capable women in Iran and abroad that should and can and will take part in shedding more light on not only the ideology as the inner causes of why these women actually participated in the war.
Let me add one. Given what I was reading your book, there is a resistance on the part of the government and the structure to allow this kind of a story to come out. So maybe to allow this kind of stories come out. And then you also mentioned in a conversation you have had with many of them, some of these women do not want to expose and say what had happened and so on.
Because it's a lack of trust, for one, and the state does not trust. The state is concerned. Some of it, I think, is just nonsense. It's concerned. I met one Revolutionary Guards commander who was a veteran at the Namaishgah Kitab, at the book exhibition several years ago, who knew that I was working on this, and he said, I just want to know your motivation for concentrating on women that nobody else wants to concentrate on. And I said, I can assure you, I'm not passing this to any intelligence service or anybody that's going to misuse this information. I just want to shed light, and I have to speak his own language, right? This is in Tehran after all. Yeah. So I said, I want to show that, people, women that actually participated in the war directly or indirectly are very brave, and they're not any different from the modern women. And that kind of convinced them. I think the state has a hard time, and part of it is misogyny too, perhaps. They don't want to say that women are really brave. It could be as simple as that. They don't want to come out and say, other than, producing children and cooking and waiting for their men to come back, there's not much else out there. There's not much to see here. I think part of it is that. And it shows in the literature that actually men put out in their remembering the war as well. You can go to the next question.
Okay, moving on to the next question, which is, what's the official position of IRI regarding women combatants and the role of women in war?
They really don't have an official line. I mean, they're the big elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about. Books do come out. In one of the books that I discuss, Fatemeh Jushi's story, there was an entire chapter dedicated to the demise of the Abadan Revolutionary Guard branch that basically went out of existence due to political wrangling within the city during the time of the war. And of course, the state didn't allow that to be published. I got that from the publisher, and they were okay with sharing the story. And I do talk about it in the book. So again, they don't want to make an official line other than what's already being said about the role of women. I truly think part of it is misogyny, and maybe if somebody talks to these women, they're gonna talk, and they don't want that, just like they didn't want Jushi to talk.
Thanks for your answer. All right, moving on. Any mention of Kurdish women who are known to fight the enemies, like ISIS in Iraq and Turkish army in northern Syria? It's not, I guess.
Well, I don't talk about Syria, obviously, but I do mention them as part of a greater group of global women that are present in all the conflicts. And I think I do talk about Kurdish women. One particular case is Farzaneh Haydarpur, who literally picked up an axe and killed an Iraqi invader right in her village. So yes, there are Kurdish women in the book as well.
Thank you. All right, next question. Fascinating book and discussion. Thank you. Thank you. I wonder whether the women who participated in the war effort were mostly from the war-torn regions, or they were recruited from all provinces and locations.
Can you read that again?
Sure thing. Okay. Fascinating book and discussion. The question is, I wonder whether the women who participated in the war effort were mostly from the war-torn regions, or they were recruited from all provinces and locations.
Women were not systematically recruited to go to the war zone, right? Especially to the front lines. The majority of the women that I do discuss in the role of combatants or first responders, or in other roles are from the region itself. So they are Arabs, they are Kurds, and they are non-Persian, so to speak, right? And they are coming from a lower socioeconomic background. The women that actually participate in the war and go to the zone are either part of the women of the state category, or in the case of women of Ardabil, I talk about them as volunteers. They ask to be sent to the war, and their request is denied simply for the same reasons that Ayatollah Khomeini was concerned that they're going to get captured and assaulted and so on and so forth. So no, there was no recruitment center, just as it was for Basijis or people that wanted to volunteer in jihad or whatever. There was none for women.
But I think you, in the book, mentioned that women in the front estates or front line area, they were thrown into the war. They had no choice. They stayed to protect themselves, their family, and then of course their country and so on. It wasn't that they even volunteered. It was imposed on them.
Well, we talk about several hundred, but there were literally tens of thousands that actually escaped, or not escaped. They fled, right? So they did have a choice to go. I mean, I do talk about that, you know, about Maryam Amjadi. I talk about Ram Hormuzi. I talk about Jushi. I talk about Zahra Hosseini. I talk about many women. All these women had the choice to get in their car and go, right? And some of them actually had to fight for them to stay. One of them got a slap in the face. I think that was Ram Hormuzi who talks about it, that her brother slapped her in the face. Like, what the hell are you talking about? You want to stay and fight the war. So, yes, they did have a choice to flee, but the ones that we discussed, the ones that do talk about their experience, they chose not to.
Thank you so much. Just a quick reminder that the book is available in our chat box for purchase. We have put down the Amazon link there. So if you're interested, here it is. So a few more questions here. This is a two-part question. Do you talk about the role of women in the aftermath of the war? Those who married and cared or caregivers to the survivors of the war, John Bazan. Right. And the second part is, do you discuss the Iraqi women in the war? So I guess.
Second part first. No, I don't talk about the Iraqi one because of, you know, lack of access to that information. I do talk about some women that actually do marry or want to marry to, or have stayed married to men that suffer from PTSD. This is in the case of Kamile Mousavi. I mean, she got beaten with a sort of water hose for years because of the severe injuries that her husband had, but she stayed with him and she delivered. Not only she fought in the war itself, but she fought a different war by taking the beatings and being staying as the companion of her husband. Yes, I do talk about those, and there was a wonderful short film that I think people in California are familiar with, Farzaneh Foundation, that actually won the short film prize several years ago, that beautifully portrays the idea of women still taking care of their loved ones way after the war is over. So yes, I do talk about it. It would make for a great project to actually go and, again, interview women that want to marry the disabled, the severely disabled. I met two, but there wasn't enough material. The book was getting just too big by the way it was going. But I visited a nursing home of some sort in Tehran once, and I met the men that were paraplegic. Some of them were paraplegic, and they told me sad stories, funny stories, they thought, of women that would come every day and would sign up to marry one of these men because they wanted to take care of them. And I said, why is that funny? And he said, I know what they want. They don't want me. They want the protection or the salary that I'm getting or the pension that I'm getting. So there's an economic component to this desire as well as an ideological one.
Thank you so much. One of our audience is a filmmaker and looks forward to further information. I'm sure that Shiori can look you up and then somehow contact you, and I'm sure you will answer her back. So that for that. I apologize for not being able to read all the questions. So this is where we have to close our Q&A. But if either of you or both have the closing words on for today, please.
Can I ask one more question here? The war was fought by a lot of young children or young people or adolescents who really were not of age of the war. As you have studied war very carefully, do we have any literature on that at all?
On
the adolescents, the below 18-year-old children who fought in the war, Iran-Iraq war.
You're talking about women, right?
No. I'm asking on the youngster and children. Did you run into any books? I don't know any of them. But
oh yeah, I mean, my first article that I wrote as a graduate student in 2007 does talk about young men who actually participated in the war. I can send you a copy.
Would you like to give us a little synopsis of your, conclusion there, or what you're finding?
So basically, what happened when the war started, for those who are not familiar, the Revolutionary Guard had evolved from the comités that were security forces that were created. And after the Revolutionary Guards were created, that's around the time that the war started. And they had created the Basij, or the mobilization force. And what happened, the category of people that could actually join the Revolutionary Guards people, you had to be 18, at least 18, 17 or 18, if I remember correctly, to become a member, and you would get bigger responsibilities, and there was a chance for you to move up the structural, the organizational ladder, so to speak. And for the Basijis, pretty much you had to be at least 13, if I'm not mistaken, or 14 to join. And that was, if you wanted to go to the front line, you had to have parental permission. You just couldn't do it. And I think I talk about Masumeh Dawlati, if I'm not mistaken, or somebody else in the book, that she lost 4 of her kids or 5 of her kids, that her last son actually had faked a birth certificate and wanting to go to war. So there was a huge amount of people that actually volunteered. Again, going back to our original discussion, these were not very secular people that wanted to do this. I mean, I wanted to join as well and go to war, but my mother said, I'll kill you before you get a chance to kill somebody else. So there is no way of that happening. So there was, I remember vividly, and in the research that I did for that article, there was a surplus of men that wanted to go to war. And in the case of women, the participation came from the fact that they would give their bangles, take off their bangles from their wrist and dedicate that to the war effort. Anywhere from there, and I talk about Layla Hassan Zadeh in Tona Karbon. She lost a son, and she goes through this incredible hurdle in her journey as a war participant. And her son gets MIA'd and all that stuff. So the volunteers just volunteered. Nobody was there to stop them. And the state, I think, was more than happy that they were doing that.
But it's interesting that the state does not want to publicize that dimension, given that international criticism that it receives. That's why, I was surprised that the state, even in the case of women, you have no official number of women. Whether it is, I don't know whether that is my question is it because they really didn't have at the beginning, this was an attack, that they didn't expect this, so they didn't have adequate recording? Or is it that they don't want to reveal because of their emphasis on women being a mother and a wife and so on?
I think it's a little bit of both. Mismanagement, this being simply disorganized. I mean, till now, we do not have an archive for the war that people can go and research in. You basically have to gather sources from here and there. Another thing is that the number that I have for 250 some odd thousand that actually died in the war, that is the average that I've gotten from 3 or 4 different numbers by various organizations. So no, we don't have a number. Now forget about women. I mean, at that time, men, just like now, they were running things and they were not concerned as to how are we going to later for posterity, how we're going to record the participation of women.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Farzaneh. We look forward to hearing about your future research. And thank you, Dr. Mahdi, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today. We hope to see you again, hopefully in person in a not too distant future. And till then, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Mahdi. Thank you, Dr. Muqnat. Thank you, Dr. Arieri.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Said.
Good night.